They mocked the soldier with his hidden farm in the cave, until the cold left Whispering Valley desperate. Wyatt Mitchell arrived in the valley at the start of a Tuesday with nothing to announce his arrival. No phone call, no warning, no prior visit. Just the noise of the old truck's engine loaded to the brim with stacked wooden crates, thick sacks of dirt, and a pile of tools that clinked every time the dirt road took a sharper curve. In the passenger seat, a massive German shepherd rested his head on the open window, his eyes half closed as if that long trip was just routine. What no one imagined that day, not even the neighbors who stopped by the roadside to watch the truck go through the rusty gate of Mitchell Farm, was that inside those crates lay the start of something the whole valley would first ridicule with harsh words, and then, when the cruelest winter in 40 years fell over the region like a heavy hand, seek out with the desperation of someone with nowhere left to run. The property had belonged to Wyatt's father, and before that to his grandfather, and before that to a great-grandfather who came to the valley with nothing more than a pair of oxen and the stubbornness of someone who won't accept that the land can be anyone's enemy. It was a decent area, with fields that had once been productive and a dense thicket in the back that climbed up a rocky hill and disappeared into a set of rock formations the valley children called, from memory, the Edge Stones. In the middle of those stones, anyone who knew the terrain well knew there was a wide opening in the rock floor, a natural cave that deepened inside the hill like a dark, cold room, larger inside than it seemed from outside. For years that cave had served almost no purpose. Wyatt's father used it to store some farm tools that wouldn't fit in the shed. His grandfather, they said, had stored some harvests there during dry spells, but that was old history nobody confirmed precisely. In recent years, after the family left the valley one by one, the cave was left to oblivion, visited only by bats and the cold that came down the hill on the nights of January. Wyatt was 36 when he came back. 12 of those years he had spent serving, most of it away with little contact with the valley beyond the calls he made to his mother, on dates he couldn't forget. He had the kind of silence that comes from years when talking too much can cost you. Not aggressive, not cold, but contained. Disciplined. Like the very body he carried with a posture the locals quickly recognized as a soldier's bearing, even without knowing his name. His close-cropped hair, the green T-shirt he wore like a uniform, and the camouflage pants completed the impression of someone who hadn't left the barracks, only changed addresses. The dog's name was Ranger. He was a German shepherd of almost 4 years, muscular with dark fur on his back and golden on his legs, trained and alert, who always walked at the same pace as his owner and stopped when he stopped, without needing a leash or a command. The valley children who saw him from afar were amazed by the size of the animal. The older ones preferred to keep their distance. In the first few days, Wyatt spoke to no one beyond what was necessary. He greeted the neighbors with a wave when he met them on the road, went to the valley's only store, Sterling's General Store, to buy what he needed, and drove back to the property with the truck already partially unloaded. He worked alone, methodically, hauling the wooden crates up the road to the cave's entrance, which was in a clearing in the back of the land, after a walk of about 10 minutes from the house. And that's when the comments started. Mr. Miller, a farmer of nearly 70 who lived on the neighboring property and had spent his entire life cultivating the surface soil with a dedication that bordered on stubbornness, was the first to say out loud what many thought in silence. He was leaning against the counter at Sterling's General Store when Wyatt passed by with another load of tools in his truck, and he said, in that slow, drawn-out tone of someone talking more to himself than to others, "That boy came back with a different head on his shoulders. Now he's going to plant inside a cave." The remark was met with general laughter. Arthur Sterling, the owner of the store, a man of about 55, broad-shouldered, and with a habit of crossing his arms when he wanted to seem more important than he was, slapped his hand on the counter with satisfaction and said that was exactly what he'd suspected ever since he heard that the Mitchell boy was coming back. 12 years away and he comes back to bury money inside rock. What a shame. Arthur had that way about him. He chose his words carefully, never crossing the line that would make him seem too cruel, but he always found the exact phrase that stuck in people's minds and came back up in conversations at tables and on porches. He was a man who had built his influence in Whispering Valley over decades less by the quality of what he sold and more by his knack for being everywhere at once, at baptisms, weddings, bad harvests, the debts he made a point of breaking into installments with a smile that never reached his eyes. The story of the soldier who was going to plant inside a cave spread through the valley with a speed that only funny stories can achieve. In less than a week, it was the talk of the bar tables, the lines at the Saturday farmers' market, and the conversations among women who met at the town square fountain. Someone said they had seen Wyatt carrying a long pipe up the hill, and the general interpretation was that he was building something in the dark, as if that itself was proof that something was wrong with him. Wyatt knew the comments existed. It was impossible not to know in a place where everyone knew each other by name and by history, but he had learned, over years of service, that people's opinions about what you do before you're done doing it are worthless. He kept working. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The inside of the cave was bigger than most people imagined. The opening in the rock was about 4 yards wide, but it widened a few steps in, opening into a main chamber with a ceiling high enough for Wyatt to stand upright with room to spare. The floor was uneven in some spots, with small bumps and holes that he leveled out with dirt and smaller stones carried from the creek. At the back of the cave, there was a wall of damp rock where a thin spring trickled clean and steady water that had never dried up even in the driest summers the valley had faced. That spring had actually decided everything. Wyatt had discovered it during one of the few visits he made to the property in the years he was serving, a quick trip to settle inheritance matters when his father left. He had gone down alone into the cave that afternoon, more out of a habit of exploring than any concrete goal, and had found the water running down the wall as if the rock was breathing. He stood there for a good while, mentally measuring the space, feeling the stable temperature of the chamber, and thought, this will work. The idea had matured over the following years, between one mission and another, as he studied whatever he could about growing crops indoors, about temperature and humidity, about the types of vegetables that thrive without direct sunlight or with indirect light. He had notebooks full of notes, measurements, experiments, references to techniques he'd seen in cold regions of the countryside during his years of service. It wasn't madness. It was a project. But explaining that to the folks in Whispering Valley would have required a patience that Wyatt simply didn't have, and an openness that, to him, didn't make sense before the results were visible. He had learned that showing a plan before executing it was the best way to invite unnecessary interference. So he worked in silence. The wooden crates became planting beds. He arranged them in rows along the walls of the cave, filling them with layers of soil he'd mixed with organic material that had fermented for weeks in a section of the outdoor property. Each bed had a depth calculated for the type of crop it would hold, deeper roots, shallower leaves. In the spaces between the beds, he laid a path of flat stones that allowed him to move around without stepping on the soil. On the walls, every few feet, he hung metal lanterns with thick glass that lit the cave with a warm golden light, making the beds seem even more alive than they were. In the farthest corner, where the spring flowed, he built a shallow, long tank out of stones and mortar made from clay and lime, wide enough to create a space of running water where colorful koi could live and thrive. The system was careful. The water entered from the spring, ran through the tank and exited through a pipe that Wyatt had inserted into the rock with great effort and patience, irrigating the beds from below before being drained out of the cave through a trench he dug in the floor. It was a nearly perfect closed loop, making use of every drop without waste. The koi swimming in the tank, orange and white and black, glided through the clear water like spots of color in a painting he'd spent months creating. There was also a ventilation system that had taken weeks to get right. With metal pipes, he'd inserted into holes in the rock, taking advantage of the pressure difference between the inner chamber and the outside to create a constant air circulation without losing the heat that the stone naturally retained. It was this detail that no one from outside could imagine. The rock didn't let the cold in. In the most brutal winter, The cave would be the warmest place in the valley. Ranger accompanied him in everything. The dog had discovered the spring before any more formal planning. One afternoon, when Wyatt had let him roam freely on the back property, the German shepherd had gone down to the cave entrance and stood sniffing the ground near the damp wall with a persistence that caught his attention. When Wyatt went to investigate, he found the spring more abundant than he'd realized years before. That was the moment he decided he'd start sooner than planned. The weeks passed. The jokes kept coming. But inside the cave, the first seedlings began to appear. It was around this time that Caleb showed up. Caleb Vance was 15 years old and had the kind of curiosity that made the adults around him slightly uncomfortable, because he asked exactly the things people prefer not to answer. He was the son of Silas Vance, a farmer in his early 40s, who had inherited a small plot of land north of Mitchell Farm and grew just enough to support his family, never managing much more than that. Silas was an honest man, hard-working, and deeply suspicious of anything that didn't follow the way he had learned to do things. He had laughed at the cave story along with the others, but without any malice, more out of habit of agreeing with Mr. Miller than from any conviction of his own. Caleb, however, had not laughed. He had stayed quiet listening to the story, and then, for days, he had taken a different route to school, just to walk along the road that bordered the Mitchell property. He couldn't see anything special from the outside. The house looked normal. The truck was parked near the shed, and every now and then he would see Wyatt or Ranger coming down the hill carrying some tool. But there was something about the constant movement, the silent discipline of that man, that didn't match the craziness everyone talked about. One Saturday morning, Caleb came down the hill with the excuse that he was looking for a cow that had escaped from his father's pasture. A story he had made up on the way because he needed some justification. He reached the entrance to the Mitchell property and stood on the road, staring at the gate. Ranger appeared first, out of nowhere, and stopped about 10 feet away from him, watching. Not barking, just watching. "He won't bite if you don't run," said a voice from behind the dog. Wyatt had come out of the shed without a sound and was leaning against the outside wall, holding a cup of coffee, looking at the boy with an expression that was neither hostile nor especially friendly. It was merely appraising. "I know," Caleb replied, which was a lie. He didn't know anything about Ranger, but he felt saying that was better than admitting he was terrified. Wyatt was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You're Silas's boy." It wasn't a question. "I am," said Caleb. "I came to see—" He paused, abandoning the cow story mid-sentence. "I came to see what you're doing in there." Wyatt took a sip of coffee and looked up at the hill behind the house. "Well, come see then," he said simply. That was the beginning. Caleb spent the rest of that Saturday inside the cave, his eyes wide and his mouth occasionally opening without a single word coming out. Not because there was nothing to say, there was plenty, but because the difference between what he had imagined and what he saw was too great to process with immediate words. The wooden beds full of greenery, the golden lanterns that swayed gently when the air circulated, the soft sound of water in the carp tank, the shelves Wyatt had installed on the wider walls, with glass jars already starting to be filled with preserves, grains, and dried roots. "Did all this grow in here?" Caleb asked, running his fingers along the edge of a bed of broad leaves. "Some of it. The rest I brought already ready to plant," said Wyatt, who was fiddling with the tank, checking the water flow. "Soon enough, everything in here will have grown inside this stone." "What about the light? Don't plants need sun?" Wyatt pointed to the lanterns. "This kind of lantern gives off enough heat and light for some species. I learned about growing things in enclosed spaces when I was in the service. Not every plant will grow. You have to pick the right ones. But enough to keep you alive, yeah." Caleb stood quietly looking at the carp swimming peacefully in the tank, orange, white, and black, gliding slowly through the clear water. "Are these carps good for eating?" "They're good for eating and for something else," said Wyatt. "Their waste fertilizes the water that irrigates the beds. Everything in here depends on everything else. Remove one thing and the whole system gets weaker." It was a simple concept that took the boy a moment to absorb. When he did, he stared at the tank with a different kind of attention. He was no longer seeing pretty fish. He was seeing a machine. Caleb came back on Sunday, and on Wednesday after school, and the following Saturday. Without planning it, without warning, he kept showing up with such regularity that Wyatt noticed but didn't mention it. Instead, he started giving the boy tasks. First, the simpler tasks, carrying water in buckets from the outer creek to the tank while the irrigation system was being adjusted. Then checking the beds, removing dry leaves, jotting down in a notebook the temperature that Wyatt measured with a simple thermometer each morning. In time, the boy started watering the beds on his own without being asked, and sometimes he arrived before Wyatt and had already finished half of what needed to be done. Ranger had accepted Caleb with a speed that said something. The dog was a good judge of character, and his approval was a form of endorsement that Wyatt took seriously. But Caleb's father didn't know where his son spent his afternoons, and when he found out, he didn't like it. Silas Vance was a man who had built his entire life around the certainty that the right land for planting is open land, with sun, with rain, with wind. That was the family tradition, the way that worked, and anything different seemed to him a threat not to his son, but to the order of things. He had grown up hearing his father say that a man who plants in the dark is hiding what he does, and that phrase had stuck in his head with the strength that only a father's words have. When he found out where Caleb was spending his free time, the first thing he did was seek out Mr. Miller to confirm what he thought. "Is this crazy?" he asked, sitting on the neighbor's porch, hat in hand. "I think so," Mr. Miller replied without hesitation. "I've never seen anything planted inside rock that turned out any good, and that boy spent too much time away. Whoever stays away from the land forgets what the land asks for." Silas went home with his certainty endorsed. He called Caleb for a short conversation that wasn't really a conversation, it was an announcement. His son would not go back to the Mitchell farm. Period. Caleb protested with arguments his father didn't want to hear. He said he had seen the cave, that it was different from what they were saying, that Wyatt knew what he was doing. Silas got up from his chair and said, in a voice that left no room for argument, "You will learn from those with roots in this land, not from someone who came from afar with a wooden box and a dog." The conversation ended there. Caleb spent days with that silent anger of teenagers who know they're right but have no power to prove it. He stood at a crossroads for a moment, sneak down to the cave behind his father's back, or respect the order and wait for time to show who was right. He chose to wait, not without cost. There was something inside the cave that had stayed with him, a small but firm certainty that that place mattered in a way he still couldn't quite name. It was during this time that Wyatt received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Martha Mitchell arrived at her son's property on a weekday afternoon with the manner only she had. She swung the gate shut with the same firmness she had used on windows and doors since Wyatt was small, walked to the porch with measured steps, as if she knew exactly where she was going, and sat in the wooden chair that was still in the same spot as always, facing the same view as always. Mrs. Martha was 63 years old. She was a woman of average height, with grey hair she wore in a braid whenever she left the house, and hands that carried the years of labor in her always short nails and palms that were never soft. She had stayed in the valley when her husband left too early, when the other children scattered to larger cities, when the property grew emptier and the valley felt smaller. She had stayed not for lack of options, but because it was the place where she recognized herself. Changing that seemed to her a greater betrayal than any hardship the valley could offer. She hadn't been among those who laughed at her son, but she hadn't defended him either. And that, for Wyatt, was a position he understood, without needing an explanation. The mother was caught between pride in her son and the judgment of the community where she lived, and there was no way to come out looking good on both sides at once. "Are you all right?" she asked when Wyatt brought 2 glasses of water and sat down in the chair across from her. "I am." "People are talking." "I know." Mrs. Martha Mitchell looked at her hands for a moment. "I can't go to the Saturday farmers' market without someone making a comment. Gladys stopped me last week to ask if you were seeing someone." She said the last words with the other woman's exact tone, which made the sentence sound even more absurd. Wyatt said nothing. "I needed to come here and hear from you what you're doing," she went on. "Not the others. You." There was a long silence, during which Ranger approached Mrs. Martha Mitchell and rested his head on her knee with a gentleness that made him seem for a moment much smaller than he was. The woman lowered her hand and scratched behind the dog's ear without realizing she was doing it. "I'm getting ready, Mom," Wyatt finally said. "For what?" He stared at the hill for a moment, then turned his gaze back to her. "For what might come. I saw things in the service that taught me the worst moment is always the one nobody expected, and the one who prepared beforehand is the one who can help afterward." Mrs. Martha Mitchell was quiet. She had learned, raising Wyatt, that when he said little, it was because he had thought a lot, and that testing that wall usually wasn't worth the effort. "Are you going to show me what you're doing in there?" she asked. "When it's ready," he said. She nodded, stood up, and remained on her feet, looking at him with an expression he had known since he was a boy. It wasn't exactly approval, but it was acceptance, as if she was saying, "I don't understand, but I know you well enough not to need to understand yet." She left without saying anything else. Wyatt stayed on the porch for a long time after she was gone, with the glass of water in his hands. There was something about that short conversation that weighed differently than the jokes and the comments, because his mother's opinion mattered in a way that Mr. Miller's opinion didn't. But there was also something he hadn't told her and didn't know how to say without sounding like an alarm. The notes in the field notebook he had kept since the service showed a weather pattern that worried him. He had studied basic meteorology during his years in the service. It was practical knowledge, not academic, but enough to recognize certain signs. The temperature had dropped earlier than expected that fall. The plants around the Mitchell farm were ripening weeks ahead of schedule, as if they were in a hurry. And in the stories he heard in market conversations, when he listened without taking part, there was mention of a winter coming differently. Colder, longer. He didn't know exactly when. He didn't know the exact intensity. But he knew the cave needed to be ready before then. Meanwhile, Arthur Sterling watched everything with eyes that had already begun to calculate. Arthur had arrived in Whispering Valley 22 years earlier, bought the Sterling's general store from an old man who wanted to retire, and spent the following 2 decades building a specific kind of power. Not the power of someone who does something extraordinary, but the power of someone who controls access to what everyone needs. He knew the name of every family, knew who owed whom, knew which crops had been good and which had been bad in recent years, and he used that knowledge with the discreet skill of someone who never leaves tracks. Wyatt's return had caught his attention from the first day, not because he believed the stories of madness, Arthur was too smart for that, but because there was something in the veteran's silence, in the methodology with which he worked, that told him that man knew something the others didn't. And knowledge was the only currency Arthur couldn't buy over the counter. He began gathering information the same way he did everything, slowly, through people. He learned from Mr. Miller that Caleb Vance had spent time on the Mitchell farm. He learned from Silas's wife that the boy had described flower beds inside a cave and a fish tank. He learned from a man who had passed by on the road at just the right moment that Wyatt had installed a system of pipes running up the hill. With this information, Arthur reached a conclusion he shared with no one. The military man was creating a food reserve, a reserve protected from the cold, from the rain, from any climate instability. And if there was a reason for that, there was also a reason for the urgency. The man expected that reserve to be necessary. Arthur didn't panic. Instead, he began to position himself. In the following weeks, he did something no one recognized as strategy because it was disguised as generosity. He started offering slightly better prices to local producers who sold directly to the general store. He increased orders from distributors in the bigger town, placing orders in advance and paying on the spot, which secured him priority. And he started stocking up. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, filling the back storage room of the general store with non-perishable foods, canned goods, bales of flour, sacks of rice and beans. While he stocked for himself, he kept the front shelves looking normal, just enough not to raise suspicion. And he kept playing the role he'd always played, the fair shopkeeper, the community man, the one always available when someone needed to talk on a Saturday afternoon. The only person who noticed something had changed in Arthur's behavior was Mrs. Beatrice Thorne. Mrs. Beatrice was 68 years old, had spent 30 of those years as an elementary school teacher in the valley, and had retired with the sharp memory and watchful eyes of someone who'd spent decades observing children trying to hide when they hadn't done their homework. She had lived alone since her husband had gone to a place of no return 6 years earlier, in a small but well-kept house just a few yards from the general store, and she had a habit of sitting on the front porch in the afternoons to watch the street's movement. It was from the porch that she had noticed the trucks arriving more often than usual at the general store. It was from the porch that she had noticed Arthur had had the back storage door widened, a small, quick job most people hadn't paid attention to. And it was from the porch that she had observed on a windy day that the distributors' trucks left empty, while the storerooms received more than the store would need to sell at a normal pace. Mrs. Beatrice was the kind of woman who preferred to be sure before saying anything. So she kept watching, and she took notes, not on paper but in her own head, with the precision of someone who had never relied on a notebook to store what mattered. One Wednesday afternoon, she crossed paths with Wyatt on the road. He was coming down the hill with Ranger at his side and a load of empty pots tied in a basket on his back. She recognized him. She had been his elementary school teacher many years ago, and she remembered him as the boy who never raised his hand but always knew the answer when called on. "Wyatt," she called from the sidewalk, "can I ask you a question?" He stopped. He looked at her with that seriousness that was now permanent, but which she could read as respect, because she had been his teacher, and that still counted for something with him. "Go ahead, Mrs. Beatrice." "Do you think this winter is going to be bad?" The question came straight, no beating around the bush in the way she had always preferred. Wyatt took a second. Then he said, "I think it's going to be different from what people are expecting." Mrs. Beatrice Thorne nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. "And Arthur is preparing for it." It wasn't a question. Wyatt looked at her carefully before answering. "It seems so." "To help people or to profit from them?" Wyatt didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne went home thinking about that silence. She had spent decades teaching children to distinguish between what is right and what is expedient, and had discovered over the years that the two coincided far less often than people liked to believe. What she had seen in Arthur over the past weeks was the maneuvering of someone preparing for the latter, for the expedient, while the entire valley was still debating whether a soldier's cave was madness or common sense. She had also overheard by chance a conversation not meant for her. Two men arguing in a corner of Sterling's general store that a supplier from the city had warned in advance about an exceptionally intense cold front approaching, a pressure system coming from an unusual direction, which experts were already monitoring, but had not yet reached the simple forecasts circulating through the valley. Arthur had received this information, and he had not said a word to anyone. September went by with a warmth that left people at ease and plants confused. October arrived with a heat that seemed excessive, even for those who knew the valley's climate by heart. The women who planted vegetable gardens in their backyards remarked that the tomatoes were ripening too fast, as if they were in a hurry. The older farmers shook their heads and said the weather was out of sorts, but without much alarm. The weather had always been unpredictable to some degree, and there were decades of adaptation to it. Only Wyatt, measuring the cave's temperature every day at 6 in the morning with the same thermometer and jotting it down in his field notebook, noticed the fluctuation was growing. On warm days, too warm. At night, too cold. The curve was not normal. It was the kind of oscillation that preceded a sudden rupture. He sped up his work. The stone shelves he had installed on the wider walls of the cave were getting full. Jar by jar, he had processed and preserved what the cave had produced over the previous months. Vegetables preserved in salt and vinegar, dried roots packed by hand, grains stored in sealed containers. The carp tank was running with an efficiency that had pleasantly surprised him. The fish had multiplied faster than he had projected, and the irrigation system that used their water for the beds had made the vegetables more vigorous than those grown in dry soil on the surface. Caleb's absence had left a void in the cave's rhythm that Wyatt hadn't expected to feel. He had grown used to the noise of the teenager's boots on the stone floor, to his voice asking questions that were sometimes annoying but always sincere, to the way he scratched Ranger's ear with his left hand while working with his right. They were small things, but the cave felt quieter without them. There was also the weight of knowing that the rift had come from Silas, and that Silas had acted that way because he had heard Mr. Miller, and Mr. Miller had said what he said because of Arthur's influence, even if indirectly. It was a chain of influence that Wyatt recognized from afar. He had seen the same pattern in poorly managed situations, where a person with sway over others could steer collective opinion without needing to yell or threaten. He just needed to speak at the right moment, to the right person, with the right word. Arthur knew how to do that better than anyone in the valley. On a Monday in November, when the sun had started to tilt in that specific way that signals autumn has stretched too far and winter is rushing in fast, Wyatt went down to Sterling's general store to buy salt and a few tools he needed. He was in front of the shelves when he heard at the counter a conversation between Arthur and a younger farmer named Travis, who had arrived in Whispering Valley 2 years ago and still relied heavily on the store for credit. "I'm going to need more beans this week, Arthur," Travis was saying. "It's tough, Travis. The distributor is running late. Things are scarce in town, too." Wyatt looked at the shelves. They weren't scarce. They were normal, full enough for the usual business. But there was something not on the shelves. There was a reserve in the back that he sensed, by the same instinct he had learned to trust over years of service. He paid for what he needed without saying a word. He left with Ranger by his side. On the way back, he stopped at Mrs. Beatrice Thorne's porch, where she was in her wicker chair as always in the afternoons. "Mrs. Thorne," he said carefully, "do you know if anyone has warned the community about what's coming?" She looked at him with those eyes of someone who had seen it all over decades. "No one has warned anything, and a month ago someone should have." Wyatt nodded. "I'll talk to my mother tonight." "Do that," she said, "and talk to Silas Vance too. He's stubborn, but he's not a fool." Wyatt went. The conversation with Mrs. Martha Mitchell was longer than the previous one. This time he didn't settle for half an answer. He explained what he had observed, what the notebook showed, what the cave could offer if the worst he suspected happened. Mrs. Martha listened without interrupting, her hands clasped on the table, and when he finished she stayed silent for a while that he didn't try to fill. "How much time do you think is left?" she asked. "Weeks, maybe a month, maybe less." "And the people don't know?" "Some suspect. Most don't." Mrs. Martha stared out the window. Outside, the wind shook the leaves with a force that seemed new, more biting, colder at the edges, different from the November wind she had learned to recognize since she was a girl. "What do you need me to do?" she asked finally. Wyatt breathed. "For now, nothing. I just want you to know where the cave entrance is, and that if something happens, you come there." Mrs. Martha nodded with a seriousness that had nothing dramatic about it. It was the seriousness of someone who receives information, evaluates it, and files it away for when it's needed. He didn't go talk to Silas that night, not because he had given up on the idea, but because the timing wasn't right. There was a sequence he needed to respect, and showing up at a proud man's door to say a storm is coming and you're going to need me was the quickest way to close that door for good. There were other ways, more patient ones. October ended with a light frost that killed the most fragile vegetables in the backyards. November arrived cold from the first day. Not the usual early winter cold that people accept as the normal start of the season, but a cold with a different quality. Drier and steadier, which didn't let up at noon as it usually did. The more attentive farmers began bringing in their animals earlier than usual. The women closed the windows in the afternoon before the temperature dropped for good. There was a murmur circulating through conversations, not yet one of alarm but of awareness, the feeling that something was different. Arthur, who had monitored the weather reports coming in over the radio every night, knew what was coming. 3 weeks earlier he had received information from a trusted supplier, a man from the city who was part of an association of rural producers and had access to bulletins that didn't reach the valley directly. The information was precise. A high-intensity cold front was coming from the south, with forecast temperatures the valley hadn't experienced in 40 years. the kind of cold that kills crops, freezes roads, and cuts off supplies. Instead of warning anyone, he had ordered 2 more trucks from the distributors. He had tripled his stock of non-perishable items, and he had started calculating, with the coldness of someone who treats a community like a market, how much he could charge when everyone else's shelves were empty and his were the only option. It was the kind of thing he had done in smaller versions before, never on this scale. But the winter that was coming seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and Arthur wasn't the type of man who let opportunities slip by. What he hadn't accounted for was Mrs. Beatrice Thorne. She had found out about the weather warning in a simple way. Arthur's son-in-law, a young man with few social skills, who worked at the general store's warehouse, had casually mentioned to his wife that his father-in-law was preparing for a cold snap no one else knew was coming. The wife had told her mother. The mother had told Mrs. Beatrice Thorne during an afternoon chat on the porch. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne went to see Wyatt that same week. He was at the entrance of the cave when she arrived, still catching his breath from the climb up the hill, with his coat already buttoned up to his neck, even though it was 2 in the afternoon. "Wyatt," she said, without preamble, "Arthur knows about the cold. He found out a month ago, and he didn't tell anyone." Wyatt stood still for a moment. Then he turned toward the cave entrance. "Want to see what's inside?" he asked. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne entered the cave for the first time and stood near the entrance for a long while, her hands at her sides, her eyes scanning every detail. The golden lanterns hanging from the rock cast a soft light over everything, the wooden beds overflowing with green, row after row, with an organization that could only have come from months of careful work. The gentle sound of water in the tank where the carp swam, calm and colorful, orange, white, and black, like paint splashes in clear water. The shelves full of glass jars aligned with a precision that seemed military, because it was. "My God," she said softly, not as an exclamation, as recognition. "It's ready to receive people," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "How many?" "Enough for what's coming." Mrs. Beatrice Thorne was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need to tell you something Arthur doesn't know I know." And she told him everything. Wyatt listened in silence, his arms crossed and his face still, in the manner of someone who receives information to process, not to react immediately. When she finished, he stared at the tank for a moment. The carp swam in slow circles, oblivious to any human calculations. "The bulletin said it would start within 3 weeks," she said. 3 weeks. Wyatt looked at the shelves, at the beds, at the ventilation system he had tested and retested. The cave was at its best. "Are you going to warn people?" Mrs. Beatrice Thorne asked. "I'll talk to whoever will listen," he said. "And for those who won't, the door will stay open when they need it." She nodded with the seriousness of someone who had lived long enough to know that forcing people to accept what's good for them rarely works. "I'll talk to folks I know," she said. "Nearly 70 years living here, I know everyone." Wyatt looked at her with something that for him came close to gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Beatrice Thorne." She made a dismissive gesture, as if waving off the thanks, and began her descent down the hill with careful steps, as if she knew that the stones could betray her. In the following days, Mrs. Beatrice Thorne did what she had promised. Not with fanfare, not with a speech, but with the discretion she had learned over decades of teaching. A conversation here, a word there, a strategic question that got the other person thinking. She told 5 families she trusted that an unusual cold spell was coming, that it was wise to bring their animals in and stock up on whatever they could at home. She didn't mention Wyatt. She didn't mention the cave. She planted the seed without giving it an address. Of the 5 families, 3 took action. 2 thought it was an old woman's exaggeration. Caleb heard about it from his mother, who had heard it from Mrs. Beatrice Thorne as they walked home together from Sunday Mass. The boy sat at the dinner table that night, thinking about the koi pond, the green plant beds, the steady warmth the stone held. And he thought about what he had left behind at his father's orders. One Wednesday morning, when the moon was still high and his father slept the deep sleep of someone who had worked all day, Caleb quietly got up, put on his boots without a sound, and went down to the cave alone. He took a handheld lantern. He knew the way by heart. He entered the cave and stood still in the center, breathing in the warm, humid air that smelled of earth and anise, listening to the sound of water in the tank. Ranger emerged from the back of the cave and ambled over to him, pressing his cold snout into the boy's hand. Caleb stood still for a long time in the dark, his hand on the dog's fur, thinking. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing on, the next morning before breakfast, Caleb went to find his father. Dad, he said, I need to show you something. Silas looked at his son with the natural suspicion of someone who knew that tone of voice. What were you up to in the early hours last night? The father asked. Caleb wasn't surprised that his father knew. Silas slept heavily, but woke at the slightest sound of a door. He had learned that a long time ago. I went to see the cave, the boy said straight out, and I need you to come see it too. I've already talked about this. Dad. Caleb put a firmness in his voice that his father had never heard before. There's a cold snap coming that's going to take everything in the ground. You need to see what Wyatt has in there before it's too late. Silas looked at his son for a long moment. It was the voice his son had used, not a boy asking, but someone who had reached a conclusion and was sharing it. Silas knew that difference because that was how he himself had been at 15, and his father had ignored him, and he had been wrong in some judgments because his father hadn't listened. He picked up his hat. Show me, he said. The descent to the cave was made in silence. Silas walked behind his son along the hill trail, hands in his pockets and eyes on his feet. When the cave opening appeared in the rock, he stopped instinctively. There was something in the contrast between the growing cold outside and the warmth coming from the opening that was immediately physical, immediate. He entered slowly. What he saw left him speechless. For a time he couldn't later recall. The plant beds full of vigorous leaves, the golden lanterns hanging from the rock walls, the koi pond with its clear water, the neatly organized shelves, jar after jar, with a quiet abundance that seemed impossible within those stones. And in the back, Wyatt, who had arrived before them without anyone calling him, checking the ventilation system with a small tool, Ranger sitting beside him. Wyatt saw them enter. He didn't move to greet them, didn't make any welcoming gesture. He stayed where he was, letting Silas's eyes take in the space. Finally, the farmer said, in a voice that had something different than usual, How long has this been here? Months, said Wyatt. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at his son, then he turned back to Wyatt. Do you think the cold that's coming is going to be as bad as they say? Worse, Wyatt said simply. Another silence. Are you going to help people, or are you going to keep this to yourself? The question came out without the filter Silas usually used with people he didn't know well, but there was something about the cavern's directness, the smell of earth, the golden light, the seriousness of that space that dispensed with filters. I'll help whoever needs it, Wyatt said. I won't charge anything, but I ask for one thing in return. What's that? That when the cold passes, those who receive help come and plant with me, not in here, out there, in the open ground. A new patch. I'll teach what I know. Silas looked at his son. Caleb was looking at his father with an expression that mixed hope with the attentiveness of someone watching something important being decided. All right, Silas said, with that objectivity of a countryman who doesn't need ceremony to make a deal. I'll talk to the folks I know. He shook Wyatt's hand. He left with his son. On the way back, Silas walked ahead, his hat pulled low over his eyes, and didn't say a word for a good stretch. When he was near home, he stopped and looked at his son walking beside him. Were you trying to teach me a lesson just now? He asked. There was no anger in the question. There was something close to humor, mixed with the uncomfortable recognition of someone realizing they were wrong. No, Caleb said. I was just showing you. Silas made a low sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a humph. It was hard to tell the difference with him, and he went home. 3 days later, the sky changed. Not suddenly. It was a process of hours. The color of the morning turned whiter than blue. Then the clouds came from the south in low, heavy layers, dense in a way that felt physical, as if the very air was gaining weight. The wind stopped around noon, that strange stillness that the older folks in Whispering Valley recognized immediately because they had seen it before, decades ago, and remembered what came after it. Mrs. Beatrice, from her porch, looked at the sky and went inside without haste. But her neighbor saw her enter and recognized in that calm movement the urgency that lay beneath it. Wyatt left the cave at 4 in the afternoon, looked at the southern horizon for a long time, and then went to get Ranger. "It's going to start tonight," he said to the dog, who looked back at him with those amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should be capable of. The cold arrived with the early morning. It came in a way that the people of the valley felt in their bodies before they understood it, a tingling in the bones that woke several of them without knowing why. The thermometer, hanging on Mr. Miller's porch, showed at dawn a temperature he had to read twice because he didn't believe it the first time. It was the deepest cold he had felt in 40 years in the valley. The surface crops didn't stand a chance. The backyard garden beds that had survived the moderate cold of previous weeks died in the first night. The foliage froze stiff, still on the stem. The tomato plants turned black before the sun rose. The farmers who went to check their fields in the morning returned with expressionless faces. It was the kind of loss that goes beyond the financial and strikes something harder to name, the feeling that months of work had been swallowed by a force that didn't negotiate. The animals had to be gathered in an emergency. Ranchers who hadn't prepared enough shelter went door to door asking for borrowed space. The priest's barn, the largest covered space in the valley center, opened for sheep and goats that it hadn't housed since no one knew when. The roads began to freeze by the end of the first day. The bus that ran the route between the valley and the larger town didn't arrive the next morning. The road was impassable. And what that meant was simple and brutal. There was no way to bring anything else in from outside. The valley was closed in on itself. The shelves at Arthur's general store were swept clean in less than 2 days, but not the back ones. The storage room that had been discreetly expanded a few months earlier was full. And when the first customers arrived at the store on the 3rd day of cold and found the front shelves empty, Arthur positioned himself behind the counter with an expression that was meant to seem sympathetic, but that Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, who was outside watching, immediately recognized as calculating. "I still have some stock in the back," Arthur said to the first group that arrived, "but the situation is tough, as you all know. The prices need to reflect that." The prices he then announced were 3 times the normal amount, in some cases 4 times. There were protests, there was arguing, but people were hungry. They had children, they had elderly parents at home who needed food, and the only other option, which they still didn't know existed, was up a hill above the Mitchell farm, protected by the ancient stone that the heat wouldn't let the cold invade. It was Caleb's father who changed that. Silas Vance had done what he promised. With the discretion of a countryman who doesn't open his mouth more than necessary, he told 2 trusted neighbors about the cave. Those 2 told 2 more. And on the 3rd day of cold, when Arthur's shelves were being emptied at prices most couldn't afford, there was a group of 12 people, including children, climbing the hill toward the Mitchell farm. Wyatt saw them arriving from the porch. Ranger sat beside him, watching. At the front of the group was Silas, hat on his head and 3 children behind him. Behind him, Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, who had climbed the hill for the 2nd time in less than a week without complaining. Other families Wyatt recognized from a distance, faces he had crossed paths with on the road at the store, on the rare occasions he had passed through the center of the valley since arriving. He came down from the porch, opened the gate, and pointed toward the hill. "The cave entrance is up there, come on." When the first group entered and felt the heat of the stone and saw the full beds and the organized shelves, there was a collective silence that lasted several seconds. It was the silence of those who arrive with despair in their hearts and find, in the place where they expected half an answer, a full answer. A young woman, holding a child of about 3 in her arms, stood still looking at the vegetables with eyes that couldn't decide where to go first. The child reached an arm toward a bed of broad leaves as if wanting to touch them. "You can stay as long as you need," Wyatt said. "There's enough food for everyone. I don't charge anything." Someone at the back of the group said, with a tense voice, "But what about Arthur? He's going to find out there's food here." "Let him find out," said Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, with a firmness that immediately diffused the tension. "This isn't a commercial establishment. This is the private property of a citizen who decided to help his neighbor." The distribution began that day and continued over the following days. Wyatt gave what the cave produced, vegetables, roots, preserves, fish from the tank, and didn't keep strict records, but he watched who came and how they came. There were families who arrived ashamed, with that posture of people who had never asked for anything in their lives and were feeling the weight of it. With them, he was quicker, more direct, handing things over without asking. There were others who arrived with genuine curiosity, who spent time looking at the system, at the beds, at the tank, asking questions that went beyond immediate food. Caleb had returned to the cave with his father's blessing. This time he was there from morning till night, helping with the distribution, explaining the system to those who asked, tending to the koi pond with the attention of someone who had learned that every animal was part of the machinery. He had grown in the months he had been away, not in height, but in something you notice in posture, in the way someone looks. On the 5th day of cold, Arthur found out what was happening up on the hill. He found out the only way things ever reached him, from someone who thought they were doing him a favor by telling him, without realizing they were feeding the problem. A man named Barney, who owed a considerable tab at the general store and had tried to pay it off with information instead of cash, came up to Arthur at the end of the afternoon and told him there were families going up and down Mitchell Hill with shopping bags. Arthur listened with the calm of someone doing calculations while they hear. He dismissed Barney with a nod and stood at the counter for a long while after the other man left. The fire inside, which in Arthur never showed itself as an open flame, but as a controlled ember, had been lit. The next morning, he walked over to Mitchell Farm. It was the first time he had gone up that hill in years. He reached the entrance to the cave without warning, uninvited, with 2 men from the valley who frequented the store and who he had asked to accompany him. Not to do anything, but to have witnesses. It was an old strategy. Never do anything that seemed individual when it could seem collective. Wyatt was at the pond when Arthur walked in. Caleb was at the back, fixing up shelves. Ranger immediately stood up and stayed put between Wyatt and the group that entered, not barking, but with a body that said it all. "Easy, Ranger," Wyatt said without turning around. He kept looking at the pond for another moment, then stood up and faced Arthur. The general store owner looked around, the garden beds, the shelves, the lanterns, the movement of people coming and going. A woman was leaving with a bag of vegetables. An older man was sitting on a stone bench near the entrance, warming himself while talking to Caleb. "Do you know what you're doing here?" Arthur said with that measured voice he used when he was angrier than any shout could express. "I know," Wyatt said. "You're interfering with local business. You're distributing food without registration, without oversight." "I'm helping neighbors," Wyatt said, with a calm that wasn't passiveness. It was the opposite. It was the calm of someone who doesn't need volume to have authority. "That's allowed. If you have any questions about private property, you can go look it up." Arthur took a step forward. "You got here just a few months ago. You don't know how things work in this valley. I've been here for 22 years. I built this. I've served this community." "With respect, Arthur." The voice that spoke wasn't Wyatt's. It was Silas Vance, who had slipped quietly through the cave opening during the conversation and was standing a few yards away, his hat in his hand, and his 2 youngest children beside him. More people were coming in behind him. News of the confrontation had traveled fast, as everything does in a small place. Arthur turned and saw the group. He recognized faces, families who had tabs at the store, people who had greeted him by name for years, and on their faces there was something that wasn't anger. It was worse. It was disappointment. The disappointment of someone who finds out that the person they trusted made a small decision when the situation called for greatness. "You knew," Silas said, with that voice that didn't need volume. "You knew the cold was coming, and you stayed quiet." Arthur opened his mouth. "The information I get is about business. You knew it was going to be this bad, and you stayed quiet, Silas repeated. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact, and the difference was important. There was a silence that lasted too long for Arthur. The two men he had brought as witnesses stood behind him, staring at the ground. "You should have warned us," said Mrs. Beatrice Thorne, who had entered without anyone noticing, her coat buttoned up to her neck and her eyes trained by life not to look away. 22 years in this valley. I knew everyone. You had an obligation to warn us, not as a merchant, as a neighbor. Arthur stared at her for a long time. She didn't blink. "I did what a merchant does," he said at last, with a firmness that was starting to look like desperation. "That," said Mrs. Thorne, "is exactly the problem." The silence that settled after that sentence was heavier than the cold outside. There was nothing left to say. Arthur stood still for a few more seconds that felt much longer than they were, looked around one last time, at the flower beds, the lanterns, the calm koi in the pond, the people looking at him with that silent disappointment, and left. The two men he had brought followed, but without the same haste of someone following a leader. They seemed more relieved to be leaving than loyal to the one they had arrived with. Wyatt stood in the center of the cave for a moment after they had gone. Ranger sat back down by the pond. In some corner, one of the lanterns crackled faintly. "Is it over?" asked Caleb, who had stood in the back during the whole confrontation. "For today," said Wyatt. The story of the confrontation in the cave reached the entire valley before nightfall, but what arrived alongside it, and carried a different weight, was the other part. The part that Silas had mentioned only to those who were there at the time, but that spread just as fast as everything else did. That Arthur had received advance word about the cold, had stockpiled for himself, and had raised prices while knowing people had no alternative. The valley's reaction wasn't immediate fury. It was slower, deeper, the kind of reaction that happens when a piece that had been out of place for too long suddenly clicks into place, retroactively explaining a lot. Old conversations took on new meaning. Situations that people had thought were too unlucky to be coincidence now had a simpler, sadder explanation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us newcomers. Now, continuing. Arthur's wife Lillian was the first in the family to take action. She went to the cave on the 6th day of cold, without warning, and arrived with a jar of homemade dulce de leche she had made the night before. A small gesture, but everyone there understood it for what it was. She spent some time helping distribute vegetables without saying much, her face carrying the weight of things she hadn't chosen. Before leaving, she stopped in front of Wyatt. "He's not bad," she said in a low voice. "He just got small over the years, and when it came time to be big, he didn't know how anymore." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. She left. That same day, there was a woman in a blue blouse with a notebook sitting on a rock near the cave entrance, listening and taking notes. Sarah Harper was 32 years old, worked for a newspaper in a town 25 miles away, and had arrived in the valley almost by chance. She had stopped to ask for directions when the cold had cut off access, and had stayed because the story she found was bigger than anything she had planned to write that month. She had spent the first few days observing without drawing much attention, which was easy because in the flow of people coming and going from the cave, a woman in a blue blouse with a notebook went unnoticed. She had heard the confrontation with Arthur from a corner. She had seen Silas arrive with his children. She had heard Mrs. Thorne. On the 7th day of the cold, she asked to speak with Wyatt. He was checking the beds when she approached. "Can I ask you a few questions?" she asked directly. "You're a journalist," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am, from a local newspaper." She named the outlet. "I've been here for 3 days." "I know." She paused. "You knew I was here? You arrived on the 2nd day with the same notebook you're still using. You haven't changed clothes, so you're sleeping at Mrs. Vera Higgins' bed and breakfast. And you take notes with your back to the wall, the way someone who doesn't want anyone reading over their shoulder." Sarah stared at him for a second. "Does the job teach you that?" "It teaches you to pay attention," he said. She opened her notebook. You knew about the cold before everyone else. You knew what Arthur was doing, and you stayed quiet. Why? It was a good question. It was the question he had asked himself a few times in the early mornings when he lay awake, listening to the wind pick up outside the cave. I didn't stay quiet, he said. I talked to my mother. I talked to Mrs. Beatrice. I talked to Silas. I tried to talk to whoever would listen. But you didn't go to Sterling's general store to tell Arthur you knew what he was doing. No. Why? Wyatt stared at the beds for a moment. Because he would know that I knew that he knew, and he'd find a way to use that. He paused. Sometimes the best way to protect people isn't to face the problem head-on. It's to make sure that when the problem arrives, there's a solution ready. Sarah wrote that down without a word. "What do you want me to write?" she asked at last. "Write what you saw," he said. "Nothing more." She wrote. The article came out in the County Gazette on the 10th day of the cold, when the road had been cleared enough for a physical copy to reach the valley. The headline Sarah had chosen was simple, something about the man who had prepared Whispering Valley for the cold that others had forgotten to warn about. There was a photo of the cave entrance with the snow in the background, taken before the confrontation. She hadn't used the word hero anywhere because she had realized over days of observation that Wyatt was exactly the kind of person that word would push away. What she had written was a careful report, presenting the facts with the clarity of someone who had been there. The months of preparing the cave, the growing system, the cold that arrived earlier than expected, the distribution of food without charge, Arthur's stockpile, the information that hadn't reached the Valley families in time. About Arthur, she hadn't written with cruelty. She had written with precision, which was a different thing. And precision sometimes hurts more. When the paper reached the valley, Arthur read it alone at Sterling's general store, with the shelves still half empty behind him. He stared at the words for a while, then he folded the paper carefully and went home earlier than usual. That night, he sat at the table with Lillian until late, without saying much. She made coffee. He held the cup without drinking for a long time. "I was wrong," he said at last. Lillian didn't answer right away. She had learned over many years of marriage to recognize when a sentence needed room to breathe. "You were," she said finally, calmly. "Now you need to decide what to do about it." Arthur stared at the coffee. The next day he left home earlier than usual. He went to Mitchell Farm. Wyatt was coming down from the hill when he saw Arthur on the road, stopped in front of the gate. Ranger stood beside his master, watching. Wyatt opened the gate without a word, and the two stood on the road for a moment with the cold passing between them like a third presence. "I came," said Arthur, and the sentence hung incomplete for a second before he continued. "I came to say I was wrong, with the wrong words and with the wrong silence. Both things." Wyatt fell silent. "I knew about the cold," Arthur said. "I've known for a month. I should have warned everyone." "You should have," Wyatt said. "I didn't. I did the math." He swallowed. "When I look at the situation now, I see myself, and I don't like it." There was a pause. "Is there a way I can help?" Arthur asked. "Not for free, to make up for what I did wrong. With an agreement the way you did with Silas, so that everyone who gets help helps out later." Wyatt looked at him for a longer moment. "There is," he said, "the storage you kept for yourself. Open it up for the families who couldn't buy before the price went up. Normal price. If there's a shortfall, we'll figure it out together later." Arthur stood still for a second. That was a proposal that cut straight to the heart of the matter, but there was something about it that was right. It wasn't punishment. It was reparation, and those were different things. "All right," he said. This time it was Wyatt who extended his hand. Arthur shook it. The cold lasted another 3 days after that. 10 days in total, longer than any forecast had predicted, longer than most people in the valley had prepared their bodies and their homes to endure. But there was a difference between the 10th day and the 1st. On the 10th day, there was a system in place. There was a flow of food coming out of the cave and from Arthur's storage, which he had opened at the prices he had promised Wyatt. and where he had sent Lillian to personally visit the homes of families with overdue accounts to tell them they could come get what they needed. It wasn't instant redemption. Things don't work that way. But it was the beginning of a difference that, over time, could become real. Mrs. Martha had spent most of the cold in her own home, but she had gone to the cave twice. On her last visit, she had stayed for over an hour, walking from bed to bed with her hands behind her back and eyes that absorbed unhurriedly. As she left, she stopped near her son. "You asked me once, when you were little, if we needed to be afraid of the stone," she said. "Remember?" Wyatt paused for a second, trying to locate the memory. "I remember. I was about 7. I thought the cave was scary. And you asked me if the stone was our enemy. Had I said the stone wasn't an enemy or a friend, that it was just stone? You did." Mrs. Martha looked at the cave opening, at the white sky outside that was already beginning to brighten a little, at the beds full of green beside her. "I was wrong," she said. "The stone was more of a friend to this community than a lot of people who called themselves part of it." Wyatt didn't answer, but there was something in his shoulders that, for a moment, seemed less tense than it had been in the previous months. When the cold left, it was sudden. The temperature rose in 2 days in a way that seemed hurried, as if winter was apologizing for its excess. The valley was wet with melting ice, with puddles on paths that hadn't had puddles in years. The roads were gradually reopened, and the first bus of the line to return was greeted by 6 people waiting at the stop, which was a lot for a place that size. With the sun, the land began to reveal itself, and what it revealed was that the damage to the outdoor fields was extensive. There were entire fields that would need to be replanted, families that would have to start from scratch a season that had already been difficult before the cold. It was then that the agreement Wyatt had made became concrete, not overnight, not without friction. There were people who had received food from the cave and who felt the agreement had been made under pressure, that they had accepted because there was no other way out. That perception took time and patience to work through, but Silas Vance was the first to show up one morning with still weak sunlight, with Caleb at his side and a hoe over his shoulder. "Where do you want to start?" he asked when he stood before Wyatt. "At the Bottom Creek field," Wyatt said. "There's an area that's never been cultivated that could be good for a first planting." "With what?" "With what the cave produced that can go into the ground now." Silas looked at his son, who already had his eyes on the hill. "Let's go," said the father. Other families arrived over the following days. Not all at once, not without hesitation, not without some prior conversation where Wyatt had to explain that the new field wouldn't be his, but would belong to everyone who participated, divided by labor and not by dollars. It was a simple concept, but one that took time to sink in for people who had learned their whole lives that land was ownership and ownership was power. Mr. Miller was one of the last to show up. He came one afternoon with the manner of someone arriving for a meeting that should have already happened. He stood at the edge of the field, hands in his pockets, watching Wyatt and Caleb and 3 other men work. Finally, he walked over to Wyatt. "I was the first to laugh," he said without beating around the bush. "I was an idiot." Wyatt stood up from the ground where he had been kneeling, checking a new row. "You weren't the only one. I was the first," the old man repeated, "and that matters." Wyatt looked at him for a moment. There was something in that stance. The nearly 70-year-old man who had spent his entire life in that valley, who had built his pride on knowing everything about land and planting, coming to admit he had been wrong. It was harder than any easy apology. "You want to help?" Wyatt asked. "That's why I came." "Then tell me what you know about the land here in the Bottom Creek field. You've been planting here longer than I've been alive." Mr. Miller blinked. That wasn't the answer he had expected. He had expected some kind of gracious acceptance, or maybe a simple task, not a question that put his knowledge at the center. "The land here drains well after a heavy rain," the old man said after a second. "But there's a pocket of clay on the right side that holds too much water. Root crops won't do well there, leafy greens will." "Good to know," said Wyatt. "Can you show me exactly where that pocket is?" Mr. Miller went to show him. That afternoon was the beginning of a collaboration that nobody had foreseen and that, seen from the outside, seemed unlikely. But it worked, because there was something Wyatt had that Mr. Miller didn't, and something the old man had that Wyatt would never have. Decades of knowledge on that specific land, with that specific climate, with those particularities that only repeated experience over generations can provide. 2 ways of knowing that together were more than each on their own. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne visited the new field a week after the work began. She stood at the edge, with her coat buttoned up, watching the makeshift rows that were beginning to take shape line by line, with an organization that had clearly been discussed by more than one person. "How many families?" she asked Wyatt, who had walked over when he saw her. 11, so far. "And Arthur?" "He sent his son-in-law last week." The son-in-law asked if he could help. I said yes. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne made that gesture of someone considering the information. "And do you think he'll change?" Wyatt thought for a moment before answering. "I think some people change because they want to, and some change because they no longer have a choice not to. The important thing is that they change." "What a teacher's answer," she said, with a tone that could be criticism or the closest thing to a compliment she could muster. "I learned from a good teacher," he said. She looked at him for a second with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was as close to one as that face could get. "Take care of the boy," she said, referring to Caleb, who was on the other side of the field, teaching a younger child how to handle a small shovel. "He has talent. Don't let it go to waste." "I won't," said Wyatt. Sarah Harper returned to the valley a month after the cold, with a new notebook and the same blue blouse. This time she came prepared, with a planned meeting with Wyatt on his front porch. She had written a series of reports that had circulated beyond the local paper. A regional portal had republished them, and then a larger state newspaper had asked to reproduce them. The valley, which was too small to appear in any publication that most residents read, had suddenly turned up in more places than she could count. "People want to talk to you," she said, sitting on the porch with the coffee Wyatt had made. "From other regions, other valleys, some want to see the cave system." "I know," he said. "Will you meet with them?" "For anyone who comes here, yes. I don't do long-distance visits." Sarah wrote it down. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said after a moment. "Go ahead." "Why did you come back? With everything you knew, with the preparation you had, you could have done this anywhere. Why here?" Wyatt stared out at the valley below for a moment. The fields that were starting to turn green again, the rooftops that had weathered the cold, the smoke from a few chimneys still burning on the chillier late afternoons. "Because this is where I'm from," he said. "And when you know the worst might come, you don't want to be in some random place when it does. You want to be where the people you want to protect are." Sarah looked at him for a second. "Can I use that?" "Sure." She did, and it was the line that got the most traction from the reports. Winter kept passing. The weeks turned into months with that gentleness that only a returning routine can bring. The noise of the farmer's market on Saturday, the smell of bread the women baked, the kids who started appearing on the road again with their backpacks and their noise after school reopened. The cave kept running. Wyatt didn't close it when the cold ended. There was something about it that had proven useful in a permanent way, not just in an emergency. He started opening its doors on certain days of the week, so the families who had taken part in the planting at the new field could come through, see how the inner system was doing, learn, touch, understand. Caleb had become, without ceremony or title, the second person who best understood how the cave worked after Wyatt. Some days he arrived before the owner and had already checked the tank, adjusted the ventilation, and made notes in the logbook. Silas had stopped commenting on it. He had reached a quiet point of pride that his son recognized by the way his father looked when he didn't think anyone was watching. Mrs. Martha had returned to the cave 3 more times after the cold. On her last visit, she had brought a basil seedling she had kept at home through the winter. "Does it fit here?" she asked, holding the seedling. "It does," said Wyatt. She planted it with her own hands, in a spot her son had opened up specially in that bed. She stayed on her knees on the stone floor longer than necessary, pressing the dirt around the seedling with a tenderness that seemed like she was doing something important without being spectacular. When she stood up, there was dirt on her palms that she didn't wipe off right away. "Will it grow?" she asked. "For sure," he said. She looked at the seedling for a moment. "When you were little," she said, "and I sent you to the backyard to help your father with the plants, you always came up with an excuse not to go, remember?" "I remember." "Look what you've done," she said, with a gesture that took in everything around them. And in that gesture, in that tone, there was something that was pride. Not the pride of someone showing off, but the pride of someone who had waited for many years and finally saw what she'd been waiting for arrive, even if in a way she had never imagined. Wyatt smiled. It was a small, close-lipped smile, the kind he wore when there was nothing left to say but plenty left to feel. "It'll grow," he repeated, this time about the sapling and about many other things at once. The spring fair, when it arrived, was different from the ones before. There were more people, there were more goods. There was, in a corner of the square, a small stall with vegetables and preserves labelled as from Newfield, with no owner's name, just the name of the field, which had become a collective in a way that the 11 participating families had formalized in an afternoon meeting with plenty of coffee and some healthy debate about who got which portion of the sales. Wyatt didn't have a stall. He wandered through the market like any other resident, with Ranger by his side and his hands in his pockets, stopping here and there to greet people he ran into. There were folks who approached him to say thank you, some with direct words, others with a simple handshake that carried more than words could. He received it all with the same nod, not of someone brushing off gratitude, but of someone who had already moved on to the next step. Mr. Miller found him near the cheese stall and stood beside him for a moment, looking out at the market. "Has this valley gotten better?" the old man asked, in that tone that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. "A little," said Wyatt. "How long has it been since you arrived?" Wyatt thought. "About 10 months. Mr. Miller shook his head slowly. "In 10 months, you've done more than most people do in 50 years. "I didn't do it alone," said Wyatt. "I know," said the old man, "but you started it." They stood in silence for a moment, side by side, watching the market unfold around them. The noise of voices, the smell of food, the children running between the stalls with that energy the cold had bottled up for weeks and that now spilled out without ceremony. Mrs. Beatrice Thorne passed by them with a bag on her arm and looked them over. "2 men standing still at a market is a waste," she said without stopping. "Go buy something." Mr. Miller laughed, a real laugh, short and open. Wyatt didn't quite laugh, but there was something in the corner of his eye that was the equivalent. They went and bought something. Later, when the market had closed and the vendors were packing up their stalls and the last conversations spread across the square with that slowness of Saturday afternoons, Wyatt climbed the hill alone with Ranger. He entered the cavern, which was quiet, lit only by the lanterns and the sound of water in the tank, and stood in the center for a long time. There was something in that silence that was different from when he had arrived. It wasn't the silence of a solitary project, a secret plan, an effort that existed against everyone's skepticism. It was the silence of a place that had proven itself real, that had delivered what it promised when the moment called for it, and that now existed with the calm of something that no longer needed proof. The koi swam in the tank with their usual calm. The leaves in the beds were lush. The jars on the shelves were full of a new batch of preserves that Caleb had prepared with the help of 2 women from the valley who had come on their own the week before to learn the technique. Wyatt knelt by the tank. He reached his hand toward the water's surface and let his fingers touch it lightly, causing that gentle ripple that spread in circles to the stone edges. One of the koi, the biggest one, orange and white, slowly approached and lingered near his hand for a moment before drifting away. Ranger lay down beside the tank with a heavy sigh, like someone who had finished a long day. Wyatt stared at the ripples in the water until they faded completely. Then he stood up. There was still plenty of work ahead. The new field needed a permanent irrigation system he was drawing up in his notebook. There were 3 families who wanted to learn the closed bed technique to use in their own sheds during the coming winter. There was a conversation that needed to be had with Silas about a long-term arrangement for the field that the 2 of them had started together. There was the proposal that Sarah had left on her last visit, a meeting with growers from neighboring valleys who wanted to see the system, what she'd called a knowledge exchange, and that Wyatt had agreed to consider. There was a lot. It was the kind of a lot that doesn't weigh heavy but that carries you. He turned off 3 of the lanterns, leaving the 2 by the entrance lit. and stepped out with Ranger into the spring evening that was arriving with the smell of damp earth and the distant sound of crickets that had returned with the warmth. The cave fell quiet behind them, full, warm, productive, and the valley below darkened slowly, window by window, as always happens when a long day ends and people retreat back into their lives with something more than they had that morning. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. If it touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you love.